Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome back Eleanor Menzin. She's a pediatrician, and today's Kevin MD article is titled Navigating Adulthood in the Digital Age. Eleanor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Eleanor was recently on. Just go to kevinmd.com/podcast. Upper right-hand corner, there's a search icon. You can search for her name to hear her story in her last episode. But today, let's jump right into your most recent article, Navigating Adulthood in the Digital Age. How did this article come together?
So it's really a culmination of things. I've been a pediatrician for about 22 years, and I'm also the parent of 3 kids in this sort of young adult, 18 to 23 range. And I've noticed that although in the old days when I first trained, people talked about kids leaving pediatric care at 18, that seemed over the course of my career to become increasingly inappropriate for a variety of reasons. And I sort of, many years ago, my own opinion on this was informed. Years ago, I read an article by a college health staff person who said, please, pediatricians, do not discharge your patients at 18. And what they said was, a healthy kid who is dropped from pediatric care at 18 tends to just see no doctor for years and years. And an unhealthy kid who has lots of medical problems, it's a terrible time to learn to trust somebody new when you're living away from home and you have chronic medical conditions. And so the college health people said, you really should hold on to these kids. And that has sort of informed my practice. And I used to think, well, when you finish college, you're done. But increasingly, I have become aware that, first of all, that border is fuzzy, right? The majority of American students don't graduate at 22 anymore. The average age is actually like 23 and a half. Most people don't take 4 years anymore. It takes longer. And the year after college is really challenging. And so it's become sort of increasingly clear to me that for all of those reasons, it's not a great time to transition to adult medical care.
So I think we talked about this last time offline that I have a daughter that is a freshman in college, just kind of that age, 18 years old, where traditionally she's supposed to be transitioning out of that pediatric care. So let's talk about that college age, 18 to 22. What specifically are some of the issues that they're facing that would require continuing pediatric care?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So what we know is that the overwhelming majority of things that affect the health of 18 to 25-year-olds are mostly in the realm of lifestyle habits and sort of psychosocial things. So we're talking about substance use, disordered eating, anxiety, depression, sleep, exercise, nutrition, relationship building. And so those are the things that really have the most impact on health in young adults. And for most people, the ideal person to discuss that with them is someone who has known them their whole life, right? There's a level of comfort there. When an 18-year-old who used to be really outgoing and friendly shows up a little bit blunted, I think an adult provider meeting that person for the first time has no way to recognize that. Whereas somebody who's taken care of them for their whole life is very quickly going to be able to say, like, hey, are you okay? Like, you don't seem quite right. I think a lot of those issues involve sort of really digging into the details of kids' lives. So I think pediatricians are accustomed to saying to kids this age, what do you eat for breakfast? What time do you go to sleep? Exactly how many drinks are you having when you go out? And it's really that specificity, I think, that is the heart of good care for this age group. And I think those folks are much more similar to 16-year-olds than they are to 60-year-olds.
Now, what's the thought about your fellow pediatric colleagues? Do they feel similarly that they should be keeping on with care up until the age of after college, 25, early 20s?
It's an excellent question. I think there are a lot of us who do feel that way. There are a lot of us who feel, I think a lot of it depends on your comfort level with dealing with some of these issues. I think pediatricians who are comfortable with contraception, with sexually transmitted infections, with substance use, and I would argue very strongly that all good pediatricians should be comfortable with those subjects. For people like that, really 18 to 25 is no big deal. It's really more of the same, honestly. I think for pediatricians who say, I don't want to deal with all that stuff, I would say you really should be dealing with that stuff in your 16 to 18-year-olds too. So I kind of got to lean into this.
So, talk about some of the other challenges today's young adults are facing that may not have been so prevalent years ago.
It's hard. This is a hard time to be a young adult, right? I think people talk a lot about social media, and I think what should be clear to everybody is that it's not going away, right? But I think even the young adults who are insightful enough to understand that what they see on Snapchat or Instagram is highly curated, right? It still is painful to watch. So if you are sitting in your college dorm room alone, when I was in my college dorm room alone, I just assumed that there were some other people who were alone too, right? And there probably were. I mean, I could hear people outside, but I also knew there were some people who weren't outside. Now I think young adults are faced with this just barrage, right, of everybody they know is having a great time. Everybody they
Yeah.
know has made their best friends for life, right? Everybody they know has a job that they love and is going to all these fun restaurants every Friday night. I mean, that's what they're showing you, but that's different from reality. And I think it's so hard and so isolating for young adults to sort of have that real cognitive dissonance between their reality and the highly curated reality that they see, on social media. I think that's one piece of it. I think I think many of the current generation had a hole in their lives for 18 months to 2 years from the
Yeah.
COVID pandemic, right? And so a lot of them missed some of those formative years of learning how to negotiate relationships and deal with other folks or live with roommates or all of that stuff. They're also, there's been a huge mental health fallout from the pandemic. So many of our folks in this age group are also struggling with their own anxiety and depression. And I think those are sort of really big issues that make it especially hard to navigate this age group.
So, what can parents do? What can I do if my daughter at college is experiencing some of these things? What are some pieces of advice that you could share with parents?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think the first thing is to stay connected, right? If you're a parent, check in. How are you? How was your day? But also more specific, like what are your plans for this weekend? Who are you going to hang out with? Right. I think at any time that a young adult or a parent notices a big change, right? So a kid who used to be an A student and now is a C student, a kid who used to go to sleep every night at 11 and now is up at 4 in the morning, right? All of those are red flags. Changes in substance use, right? A kid who used to never drink and has been to the infirmary for alcohol poisoning, that's obviously a huge red flag. But it's more than a mistake, right? Like there's something going on there. So I think staying connected is really important. I think normalizing bad feelings and imperfection, right? So saying to our young adults, this is hard. The transition to college is hard. The transition to being a grown up is hard. Adulting is hard. It's sometimes really demoralizing to get up in the morning and go to work. And normalizing those feelings is really important. And then providing resources and saying, like, hey, if you feel like you're not yourself, right, there's help out there, and we can try to figure out together what you need to get there. And obviously, since I wrote this article, it's my belief that you should start with your pediatrician and some healthcare provider who has known you for your whole life and can say, all right, let me help you kind of like dig this out. One of the things I try to say to my patients before they go to college is, and I think it's true for parents of kids like this too, is I can't solve problems I don't know about. So I can help you with almost every problem if you tell me what's going on. If you hide it, I have no way to help.
So, how can we direct our college age children to support? Because a lot of times they're not in the same city as us. They're sometimes halfway across the country. They can't see their regular pediatrician, and their parents could be thousands of miles away. Let's say we recognize one of those red flags. What can we do in that scenario?
I do think it's worth reaching out to your primary care doctor because they may have resources. They may be able to see your child virtually. We do that. They may also have connections, right? I mean, it's not, uh, we're all sort of intermingled, right? So sometimes I'll email an old residency or medical school friend and say, hey, I need somebody in Pittsburgh. So I think that's one thing. Student health, college health centers are set up usually to do short term counseling. I think that's a great option for crisis counseling. It's usually not a great option for long term, but interestingly, most college health centers have a list of practices in the community that they refer their patients to who need longer term care. And so I think getting your hands on that list and then just email calling until you find somebody. And one thing I would say is I think there's this very adult medicine tendency to say, well, you're 18, so you have to do this yourself. And what I would say is that's a big ask for a struggling 18 or 20-year-old. And so I think it's totally acceptable to say to that young person, listen, it sounds like you really would benefit from a therapist, and I'd like to help you find that. And it can be a lot of work. So could I make the initial inquiries for you and make some phone calls for you and find somebody who has availability? Tell me what your schedule would support. Tell me where you can get to or what blocks of time you have free. And let me do the sort of legwork of being like your personal assistant here and do this. Because for a kid who's struggling with anxiety and depression, saying to them, call student health and get yourself an appointment is often a totally overwhelming task.
In your article, you talk about some of the neuroscience perspective of young adults as they mature into adulthood. Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we know from really good cognitive science that cognitive maturity is now, we think, closer to 25 or 26. So it certainly doesn't line up with the legal definition of adulthood at 18. And I think one of the things that's so hard for physicians and caregivers and parents of this age group is, if you are, and this number is totally made up, like 90% cognitively mature. Let's imagine you're 90% cognitively mature. I don't think what that actually looks like is you make decisions sort of 90% on cognition and 10% on some funny sort of, premature schema. I think what it actually means is 90% of the time you act cognitively like an adult, right? And 10% of the time, all bets are off. And so I think that's the problem, is you can have a young adult who's a great decision maker 90 or even 95% of the time, but the other 5 or 10% of the time they do things that no adult in their right mind would ever do. And that's cognitive immaturity. But it's so hard to understand because it's the same person who made a great decision yesterday. And the answer is, yep, like that's how cognitive maturity works.
So we're talking towards the end of September, and a lot of us freshman parents, their kids are in college for about a month now. What would you say are the highest yield things that we should do, and what are some of the biggest red flags that we should not do?
So I think the biggest red flag overall, and I think this is true, the parental behavior I wish we could all avoid, and this is probably true for life, is the sort of minimizing or dismissing a child's attempt to express emotion. So when your 19-year-old calls you crying and says, I have no friends and this is terrible, and I da, 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 I think the single worst phrase is don't be silly or don't be ridiculous, right? Because even though you as a grown up know that this will pass and your child will be fine, they don't know that. And so if they reach out to you to express an emotion and you minimize that by dismissing it and saying, like, don't be silly, don't be ridiculous, they're really stuck, right? So what they hear in response to that is, my dad's not listening to me, right? That leaves them two choices. They can close down and just shut you out, or they can up level their expression of emotion by doing something like stopping going to class, and then you'll see how really unhappy I am, right? So I think the biggest thing to do is to not minimize or dismiss that emotion. The counter, of course, is the best thing you can do is to acknowledge it, right? And to say, like, I get it. This is terrible. It's so hard. right? It's so hard. And then to try to help them do a little bit of like sort of home CBT, like, do you think it'll be like this forever? Like, was it like one bad day? Like, what was yesterday like? Do you have plans for tomorrow? Right? Can you try to help them reframe it as, this is maybe not the end of the world and maybe not fall into catastrophizing, which is, the favorite habit of many young people. And then also to be open about the fact that there are resources for help and support, and that if your kid needs them, you are there for them to help them find that.
We're talking to Eleanor Menzen. She's a pediatrician. Today's KevinMD article is titled Navigating Adulthood in a Digital Age. Eleanor, tell us some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
So I think my take home message is 18 to 25-year-olds are awesome, right? It's a great age group. I like to think of them as emerging adults, right? They're not adolescents, but they're also not adults. And so what I would encourage providers and parents and people in that age is to think of them that way, as a separate category, right? And to make sure that they're getting the health care that they need. I would not assume, if you're the parent of a kid this age, that they can or should transition to adult care. I would have that conversation openly with their pediatrician. And if they do transition to adult care, I would make sure that it's somebody who really feels comfortable taking care of this age group, because they come with their own special things that need to really be paid attention to.
Eleanor, thanks again for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.